if you're speaking truth every day through your life and stuff, I think the hardest thing to deal with that is that people will hate you. If you're always in truth, and you always just have to say what's real, and then people don't want you to say what's real, like the water crisis in California, and you can be at high levels of decision making and people still want to ridicule you, and then at one point you go, okay, well, what's going to happen is going to happen. And, you just let things go, and you just realize that things are going to go the way they go.
Hello, welcome to We're the Leaders We're Looking For, a podcast from United Way of the Wine Country, produced with tech support and direction from Brant Hokinga and Tiv Branding. We are here to share the voices of our neighbors, change makers, and everyday leaders who are building a region rooted in belonging, resilience, and justice. And I'm Lisa Carreño. I'm President and CEO of United Way of the Wine Country. Thanks for joining us, and let's get started. In this episode, we are honored to welcome Charlie Toledo, Executive Director of the Susquehanna Intertribal Council. For decades, Charlie has been a powerful voice for Indigenous rights, land stewardship, cultural revitalization, and restorative healing across Napa and the greater region. In fact, her work has international impact now. Her leadership is rooted in deep ancestral wisdom, community care, and a lifelong commitment to protecting the land and the people who belong to it. Charlie's work reminds us that leadership is not simply about influence. It is about responsibility, reciprocity, and remembering our place in the long story of the land. Through the Susquehanna Intertribal Council, she has created spaces for cultural education, youth empowerment, environmental protection, and Indigenous presence to be both acknowledged and truly honored. Charlie has also been intentional about making these spaces inclusive for non-Native people. That is how I have come to know her over the past 3 years, through her generosity in opening her circles so that we can learn together, receive her teachings, and experience our inherent oneness with all that is. It is an expansive oneness that embraces everything seen and unseen, past, present, and future generations, and all sentient beings. Being in these spaces with Charlie has grounded and strengthened me in profound, indelible ways, shaping my professional and community life, and always guiding me toward becoming a better human. In this conversation, Charlie invites us to reflect on what it means to lead with humility, with reverence, and with a fierce dedication to truth and healing. Her voice adds an essential thread to Season 1, expanding our understanding of courageous leadership and reminding us once again that we are the ones we've been waiting for.
Well, it's beautiful. It makes me want to cry.
Welcome, Charlie. It's so good to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I like I said, I'm honored and I'm grateful. So, our first question is always this: what story of your life reminds you why you do this work?
Well, I think it's not a story, but just a memory. I'm one of those people when they get born, they forget where they came from and who they are. And so I'm one of those people who didn't do that. And so I always knew, I think probably at the age of 3, I was aware of, I could see things and pay attention to things that other people weren't seeing or paying attention to. So I started being, a conscious being really at the age of 3. But even in utero, I remember that time. And so I was always aware of that we were being born into a time of dramatic change, and that it was really important to pay attention, and that it was really risky for us. In the past, people like myself had been killed publicly and all that stuff for quite a long time. So, and then also being Native American, being born into this DNA, there was the genocides here and the lies about the genocides, what I call the myth of discovery. And then the European invasions that were the beginning of the genocides in the United States, but especially harsh in California. And in New Mexico, there was still a real visible presence of Native people. So we knew that we were a part of that world, but we weren't a part of it. We'd been forcefully assimilated. My grandparents were taken as babies. So I could see that disconnect early on. And I was aware of it. But being born into a large family, my father was one of 12 siblings, and I was one of 10, but oldest, a second twin with a brother 15 months younger. So I was in an age group of 5, under 5, which makes for kind of like a little village. We were our own little cosmos in New Mexico in the desert. We were allowed to play outside, and we developed our own cosmology, We had our own little universe, our own world that we lived in. Collectively. So I think that answers the question.
What I get when I hear you talk about the story of your life, remembering your origin, being able to see, hear, understand what really happened compared to what you were being told about what happened, and knowing.
I think in our world in New Mexico, we weren't being told, because the Native population could still see. But we knew we were separate from it, but we weren't separate from it. So I don't think we were being told, not like in California, say, or New York. Some of the areas where the genocides were particularly harsh and the population was nearly wiped out. In New Mexico, we could see the tribes. We went to the, pueblos and the villages and went to, ceremonies and stuff. So that was part of my early childhood. So it wasn't separate. I wasn't. And then we didn't, because we were this little posse of kids, we didn't pay that much attention to what the adults were doing or talking about, except when it was time to eat or go to church or something. But I think the church, being raised in the Catholic Church, I knew that I was separate from that. But it was just something you just kind of had to do, and you just think, okay, this is the part we got to do. And we just kind of did it. But I realized it wasn't real, I guess is the word.
It is just so profoundly interesting to me that as a posse of kids and as a 3-year-old, you developed your own cosmology, as you just said, to help you navigate and meet all of the inconsistencies and myths and harsh realities of the world that you were inhabiting and inherited, so to speak.
And it wasn't that inconsistent because we were just outside all day playing, creating. So it wasn't until we started going to school, I think, and then especially moving to California as an 8-year-old, and that's when the worlds was separated out. Because it was the Anglo world and the white world, and we knew we were different than that. But my mother really wanted us, which we understood, especially as adults, why she separated us from. It's kind of like New Mexico. The whole state was like a reservation, so it was pretty violent and primal and stuff. And she separated us from that and moved to, Orange County, which is predominantly Anglo. And so we knew that we weren't that. And we could see it. But again, we were a large family because by the time we moved, we were 8 children, then 10 children, and we were going to Catholic school, so we were separate even still from the neighborhood. And then the kids, we would charge them money to come and play in our backyard. Let's just put it that way. We got in trouble when my mother found out, but we made quite a bit of money, because we had our own, I guess, gang, you would say, but, our posse, so we were real secure. And I never went any place alone, I think, until I was like 18.
Wow.
I always could never leave the house without my sister or brother, or, in high school with friends. We always had to be in groups. And so in that cluster, it's kind of protective cluster.
Yeah.
And then we knew, because my mother would say, because we were in understanding the dream realm is real and stuff. And that's what I would do. Sometimes if I had a really profound lucid dream, I'd be sitting on the bed, and all my brothers and sisters would be sitting around, and I'd be telling them a dream. And my mother would interrupt us, and then she'd say, don't talk like that when you go outside. And we'd go, okay. So we did it. That was a big step when I started to talk about metaphysics and the kind of the different realms of reality, different dimensions of reality. And that wasn't until actually pretty recently. I'm trying to think. I think maybe 2011, like publicly. I was always teaching classes and stuff, and I always had a group of people that I was working with. But as far as just starting to talk about the dream realms and the different shifts of cosmic ages and stuff, that were like how I talk now about moving into the Aquarian age and the end of the Piscean age. I wasn't talking like that at all publicly, because it was still too dangerous, Now it's not quite so dangerous.
Yeah. I the it just feels like there are all of these different layers and experiences of claiming and naming and manifesting throughout your life, from the time you were so young to becoming the presence that you are now and the voice that you have now.
I think I've always had the force. I think even as a child, sometimes people were scared of me. And then I know that I was just thinking about it on that drive over here. I was thinking about a funeral that I went to. A friend of mine's dad had died, and I didn't want to go into the Catholic Church. My friend was like, come on, let's just do it. And she wasn't Catholic, or she'd been raised Catholic too, but she didn't. And then we did go in, and I went in really cautious. And it was, I don't know, it was about 300 people, so the church was full. It was a kind of famous person it was my friend's dad who had passed. And the priest, when he was doing the mass, he kept giving me these dirty looks, and I was like, because it felt like he could see me, but we were having a telepathic battle. And at this point, I was an adult, so it wasn't very long ago, probably 20 years ago. And he was thinking, we get you, when you're dead, then we get you. You think you're here, you think you got away, but you didn't. And then I was just like, crap. And then my friend is like, do you know that guy? And I was like, no. She goes, why does he keep looking at you like that? I said, I don't know, but I'm going to leave now. And I just got up and left, in the middle of Mass, which back then was really still a big thing, just to get up and leave. But I thought that was interesting, because I haven't had that experience, but that was real profound, because I felt like the person was a personification of evil, and that they are, harvesting souls. And then he thought, he was just letting me know telepathically while he was doing the Mass in front of 300 people that, we got you. And I was like, no, you don't.
Right.
But so those are all those things that go on. But that kind of stuff now is really overt, what's happening in our society right now. That struggle of the negative and the positive, and the kind of the soul harvesting, or whatever it is that you would call that.
You have often said in the meditations that I've been joining you in for almost 3 years, that what we're seeing right now is being revealed because it's what we're meant to see.
Right. Everybody's waking up, like from a dream.
Yeah. Do you want to share more about that?
Well, I think that, the dimensions that I talk about a lot, that there's multiple dimensions of reality interfacing this third dimension that we're in, this physical world. And the illusion for most people is that this is real and everything else isn't. And so the fourth dimension started disappearing around 1986, and that's when there was a lot of channelings going on, a lot of books being written, Seth and Michael. And that's because the fourth dimension, which is the dimension just above the third dimension, it looks like the physical world, but without the physical matter. There's no matter. It's emotional body, really. And then the fifth dimension is what some people might call heaven, or that higher dimension of the higher self, the ascended self. And so the fifth dimension started compressing the fourth dimension. And so that dimension either had to ascend or or descend to the third dimension. So that's why there were so many of that, because a lot of those entities were just descending, coming into the third dimension. But also that was a way of preparing people, especially people in the Western and the industrial nations, because in other countries it's not like that, but in the industrial world, a real firm contact that this physical reality is all there is. And so that started helping prepare people. Well, maybe this isn't all there is. And then now what's happening, which is real exciting, is the fifth dimension is blending in with this dimension. So the world's becoming very fluid. And especially now, moving into the year of the horse, the fire horse, that things are becoming more fluid. So that means things will be changing really rapidly. And things that we imagined were solid, they won't be as solid anymore. They're not already. Because some people think of institutions as solid, things like the Catholic Church or the government or, that cement wall. All that stuff is real and everything else isn't. And so that illusion is being dispelled.
Charlie, when in your life have you had to pause, listen deeply, and see with new eyes?
I thought about that question because I don't think I ever did. I didn't. I do pause, because I meditate all the time. And then I started praying and meditating really as a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. And that's one good thing I got from the Catholic Church is the meditation and being raised in Catholic schools with Irish nuns. Irish nuns are very esoteric. So my 3rd grade teacher, she'd had us meditate all the time. We would do visualizations, and if somebody lost something, you'd pray for something, or you'd just say, so we would start class and meditate. And I always was meditating. I was always dreaming. People thought, I think sometimes, I remember one of my cousins, and that's one of my early childhood, does she talk? Because I didn't talk that much, which cracks people up now. But I was always watching.
Yeah.
And so I remember them saying, does she talk? And then I wouldn't talk. I'd be like, you can't make me talk. But just that thing of watching and trying to discern what other people could see or not see. And so I think there was different times, like I took that one pause where I just bought a one-way ticket to Europe after the Vietnam War. We were protesting the draft, and because Orange County has the strictest draft board in California back in the 1960s and 70s. So that means in high school that my brothers and my classmates were being forced with either getting college degrees, which in Catholic schools we were being directed to be college-oriented, but some of my brothers weren't that intellectual, so they were going to have to be facing the draft, right, at 18. They'd have to sign up. And if they didn't sign up, the FBI would be at their door on their birthday if they hadn't registered for the military. And they had the choice of getting arrested right then in their home or going down to the draft board and signing up, which the FBI would escort them there. So that was in high school, 1968 in Orange County. That was that reality. So even in high school, a lot of us were really starting to rebel. And that's when I understood about the military-industrial complex, I think when I was 16. And I understood what that was, and I thought, I'm never going to feed into that. Again, thinking of things as realities that you feed or don't feed. I thought, that's not going to be a part of my reality. So I became an active draft counselor in high school and actually went to training after high school, working with young men to help them avoid the draft in legal ways. And then the war in Vietnam ended, the involuntary draft ended, and so I took a leave of absence from college and never did go back. But I just came up to San Francisco because it was such a big party going on, We had friends in the city, so we'd been coming up to party and demonstrate in the streets. And then at one point I just thought, I'm just going to take a break and go to San Francisco and hang out, which I did. And then that was a party, it was really fun. With Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane and Janis Joplin lived down the street from us in the Mission District, and they had these free concerts in the park. So it was really a very, very celebratory time. But then the party started to shift. There started to be the LSD that was getting given away free on the street started having acid, or not acid, but speed cut into it. So people were having bad trips, and that analysis of, And there used to be the statement, is love it or leave it. And I thought, well, I can't love it, so I'll leave it. And I was getting tired of people just talking and not doing stuff. I was about 20. I think it was my 21st birthday. I got a passport and bought a one-way ticket to Western Europe and that was probably the pause I did in my life, getting away from the Catholic upbringing and being, surrounded by siblings. I have 100 first cousins and all my brothers and sisters. So just moving myself out in a singular entity out into the world. At the time, of course, I thought I was all grown up, but, now from 76, 21 seems pretty young. But then there was all these people who were traveling around Western Europe, and because of my experience draft counseling and my experience resisting military induction, the young men traveling around in Western Europe at that time were from Germany, the United States, South Africa, and Israel, the countries that had enforced draft. So I was still doing a lot of draft counseling, and then just partying. There was a lot of just fun going on.
Having fun, yeah.
So I was doing that, and I was going to go. I really wanted to go to Afghanistan back then, but then when I got to Istanbul and stuff, I realized it was too dangerous as a single woman. I was traveling with some guys. I'd meet different people and travel. But then I thought, I wasn't going to do that by myself. So then I went and spent the winter in Israel and really saw, again, the divide there. It's very similar to the genocides of California and New Mexico, where the Arab population, Muslim population had been wiped out and relocated into camps and stuff. And I was living on a small kibbutz in the south of Israel, south of Tel Aviv, midway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And we would go hiking in the hills a lot, very similar to New Mexico, the desert there, kind of a semi-arid desert, and see these ruins of these buildings. And I would ask the kibbutzniks, what is this? And, we had to blow up the houses because we didn't want the people to come back and say, that's my father's house. And I said, when did that happen? And that was the Israeli wars that occurred shortly before I'd come into Israel. And then we traveled, because we had time off on the kibbutz, and it was really easy to hitchhike around Israel. So I went up into the camps in Jericho and stuff and met with Muslim people in the refugee camps. And then I realized I wasn't going to stay in Israel because I was thinking the kibbutz, I thought of communal living. That's what I was being attracted to, communal living and stuff. And then I realized it was very structured. And then it was predatory, that the British and the American government gave Israel to the, quote, Jewish people, but it was fully inhabited. Mm-hmm. Just like California, again, the myth of discovery, that same Euro invasion, genocidal takeover of land and people's lives. So I didn't want to participate in that, so then I traveled to Greece. And so I just traveled around for a while and I found myself back in London and was really happy there with my friends. But then I had a kind of a visionary experience when I'd first left in south of France. And I had seen, we were in a bar, and this guy was arguing with me about your country. And I said, it's not my country. And he goes, show me your passport. And I was like, And then he said, show me your passport. You're a tourist in this town. You have to carry a passport with you all the time. I know you have it on you. So I'm like, okay. And I took out my passport. And then he said, look, there's your name. There's your face. You're an American citizen. You're lying to yourself if you think you're not American. And that was kind of like a cold water in my face. And I had like a vision, which I would periodically in my life. Everything just went dark, and I saw this huge dragon just standing with its feet in the United States. Just fire, just raging, scorching the earth. And I thought, if you've come to kill the dragon, you have to live. You have to go where it lives. And I thought, oh, man. I had just been 2 months out of the United States. I'm like, don't make me go back there. But I just said, well, okay. Tell me when it's time to go. It was the least amount of responsibility I'd ever had in my life. Again, as an older sibling in a large sibling group, I was caretaking babies, from the time I was about 3 and 4. And so I was just like, well, just let me party for a while. Tell me when it's time to go home. And I heard, okay. And then I was just back in the bar with my friend, and we were, carrying on with our argument. But I thought at that time I had the clarity that I would return to the United States and that I would find the iris of the eye of the dragon, because most people don't realize that the iris of the eye is actually a hole to the brain, and it's the blind spot of the eye. So I thought I'll just dwell in the iris of the eye of the dragon. When it's time, I could just pith the brain. So that was took about 3 minutes. It takes longer to talk about it than it happened because it was just a real quick flash. And then I was just in this little village in south of France having a good old time. So I kept, on with what I was doing. But then when I was back in London, I was staying with some white South African friends of mine that became lifelong friends that I had met on the road and traveled with through Italy and Greece and Turkey. And then his brother had been living in London, so I was making my way back. He had gone back to South Africa to fill his military obligation. And his other friend, because there was two friends that I had decided to stay in Israel and didn't go back, which meant he could never go back to South Africa. He became a global citizen. Both of them did. But anyway, at this point, it's 18 months later, I'm in London living with his brother. And then I had another little vision that, it's time to go home, to the home of your grandfathers. And I remember I just started crying because I was in a record shop. And back in the 70s, they used to put Lakota Indian chiefs on the record albums, which now would be appropriation and culturally inappropriate. But at that time, it was like groovy. And I just was looking through the albums, and this chief, everything went black, and the chief sort of became animated. He looked at me and goes, "It's time to return to the home of your grandfathers." I'm like, I just put the records back, and I just started crying. I walked out, and I was in Piccadilly Square, and across the square was this big sign, one-way ticket to Los Angeles. And so I just walked across the thing, and I said, "When does the flight leave?" And they said, "Tomorrow." And I'm like, "Okay, I'll take one-way ticket back to Los Angeles." But I was just crying the whole time.
Wow.
And then I went back to where I was staying, had been staying for about a month, and I told my friends that I was staying with, I'm going back home. And they was like, "Why? What are you doing? Are we having fun? Did we do something wrong?" I was like, "No." And then back then you wouldn't talk about that stuff because it would be considered, what are you talking about? What were you on? So I just didn't need anybody else to censor or give me thoughts about what I was doing or why. And then that was I think that was one of the hardest points in my life, was just making a decision to come back into the United States when I was pretty happy where I was. But I just came home. I flew back to Los Angeles, and my family picked me up, and I told my mother that I was going to stay with her till she let me go, because she'd always felt like I'd run away, and I was always having nightmares of her chasing me and trying to kill me. And then she would always write me a letter and say, "I had a dream you came home." I said, "I had a dream you were trying to kill me." So we had that kind of thing going on for quite a bit of my early adulthood. But I told her when I got there, I said, I'm going to come back until you realize I'm an adult. I can take care of myself. And you have to stop chasing me around. And she goes, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to stay here until you realize that we love each other. But we're very different, and it's better if we don't live together." And she's like, "Okay, what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, I want to get a job and save some money." So I did. And I was, hanging out with my younger siblings. I had 7 siblings that were still at home. And then I had a job for about a month. And then at one point, my mother kind of called me into the hallway. I'd been there, I think, for like less than 30 days. And she's like, "Okay." I said, "Okay, what?" And she goes, "Okay, like you said." I said, "Like I said, what?" I actually made her say it. She goes, "We love each other, but we're really different. It's better if we don't live together." And I said, "Okay." So just, she goes, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to leave." And she goes, "When?" I said, "Probably in about 20 minutes. And she's like, "Okay." I said, "Okay." So I just called some friends, and I left in 10 minutes. A couple of my friends from Seal Beach just came pick me up, and then I made my way back to San Francisco and ran into the FBI. So it was my first permanent address in 3 years, and I think I was there for 3 days. And the FBI was at my front door with a search warrant that had my name on it. And that was probably about 1972. The fall of 72. And I'd had a boyfriend living in Napa who'd been wanting me to come up and stay with him. And I was kind of like, "Come and live in the city. Come and live in the country." So we had that kind of dialogue going back and forth. And then I just had my conversation with the feds. And I won't talk about it because I was too bad. I was so bad. Not bad, but just very wild when I was younger. I had the thing, bring it on, baby. Because then they had a search warrant. They said they had a good hint that I had a boyfriend named Romeo who was stealing typewriters, and I was storing them until he could sell them. And I was like, "Wow, you guys." I said, "Well, you can come up." I said, "I'm staying with some other people, so you can search my room, but I can't give you permission to search the rest of the house." And they're like, "Okay." And so they came up in my room, and I shut the door behind them. But I had my hands on the doorknob, and I was standing between them and the door that I'd closed. And just said, "What do you guys really want?" I said, "Who makes up your stories?" I said, "That's pretty bogus." And they were like, "Well, do you have a boyfriend?" I said, "Oh, you guys want to?" And they're like, "What?" I was like, "Come on." I said, "Okay, I'm going to let you go this time, but next time you come, you better be ready to fuck me."
Wow.
And I just opened the door and let them out, and they went running out. And So I just packed my backpack right after they left and just told my housemate that I had just been living with for 3 days. She goes, "Who is that at the door?" I said, "Oh, it was the FBI. What did they want?" I said, "Well, they were looking for me. They had a search warrant with my name on it." And she goes, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to leave." And she goes, "We can't pay you the rent back." And I'm like, "Well, it's okay. You can keep the rent." And she goes, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, it's better if you don't know."
Yeah.
Which I always think that's a line in a movie. I thought they made it up. They copied me because I said that. But then I just left and called my friend that was living in Napa, and I was going to another friend's house in the city. And I said, "Well, I will come up and spend the summer there." And I told him what happened because we were used to the feds coming around. Because when I left, the FBI was at our door all the time looking for guys that had left Orange County without registering for the draft. So the FBI was really active tracking down what they used to call draft dodgers.
Right.
But it was always other guys. It was never me.
Sure.
And then all my friends were either in Canada, they were doing community service, or they were in jail, So I was just me there. It wasn't the party anymore. And so that's what brought me to Napa. And it took me a while to realize that that was the eye of the dragon. That's where I was going to settle and live and where I am now.
Yeah,
That's
still
how
there.
I got there.
You've already begun to answer this next question, Charlie. What practices help you stay rooted in your values when the world feels overwhelming? I've heard you talk about prayer and meditation.
Yeah.
I've heard you talk about listening to your intuition and following that voice. I've heard you talk about believing your visions when you have those lucid moments in dream time or otherwise, and following that divine guidance, and underlying all of it, I've heard you describe like this courageous kind of willingness to adapt. But how would you describe the practices that help you stay rooted when things
I
get...
think you described it pretty well. Actually, your introduction was really impressive. I was like, wow, is she talking about me? But I think when you start meditating, and like our family, we're dream walkers, so that's a alternate reality. And I think we don't take things as serious as other people do. And so, but the meditation is a part of that, just an integral part. Because I remember I think when I was 11, I was having really lucid dreams, which I guess is pre-pubescent, so that would be a time of all of that stirring up. And I used to just think my dreams were so lucid. And I remember one dream I'd had that was really profound. And then it was a drama. I won't get into all the detail of it. But at one point, I took control of the dream and told the person who was trying to kill me, I said, "No, you're the one who's going to be tied to the train track. And you're the one who's going to..." And I was like, okay. But I remember the next day, I was just out in the yard thinking, where do those people go when I wake up? And then I was really contemplating that this person who had been sort of terrorizing me in the dream, because it was like a movie and they'd say stop and then rerun it, and make it more scary. And then all of a sudden I said, "No, wait a minute, this is my dream. And if you don't like what I'm going to do, you can get out of here. And, it's going to be you on this, getting the train come right up to you so you can feel the heat." And then I thought, where did those people go? And why did that guy do what I said? I was just thinking about it, but I thought, well, because he didn't have a place else to go. If I kicked him out of the dream, where would he be? And then I thought, when I was awake, I thought, what if I'm just dreaming? What if this person wakes up? Where will I go? And then just, having those really pretty complex thoughts for an 11-year-old. Yeah. But just really contemplating that. And then at that point, again, in the Catholic framework, thinking I'm in God's dream and God is holding us, and having faith in that. That was what just made me think, oh, okay, whatever. But it was around 3 or 4. And then just knowing that, I think that's something I used to try to teach people, which I don't. And I realized one of my closer friends recently was doing an interview like this, actually a podcast, and asked me about that. And she said, "Could you talk more about that?" And I said, "I don't talk about it too much because it's not something I can teach somebody. And then people get mad at me." And then she did get mad at me because I wouldn't talk about it more. And then also that I was telling her, I can't teach you how to do that. It's something that's sort of, I think it's in your DNA, it's genetic. But it's also, being a clairvoyant, it's very close to being a schizophrenic. And so it's a thin line between what's a mental illness and what's not. And that was something I thought a lot about in high school, and then just again in my family line, because we have a lot of mental health issues in my family. Not my actually my immediate family, but extended family too. Mm-hmm. And so that's something we've always looked at, that, okay, is that over the line or is it before the line? And it wasn't until I started studying mental health and mental health issues and understanding through the Western mind what's schizophrenia, what's depression, it has to do with serotonin and the receptors in your body, that you have most of them are like V's, and so one side is the link of the V, and so one side sends and the other side receives, and that's what passes feel-good hormones or anxiety hormones around the body. So a person who's clinically depressed, they don't have the V. They've got all just these I's, and so they're not having the transportation system to feel good. And then schizophrenics have a bunch of W's, and so they're receiving too much data. Right. And so the difference of a schizophrenic and a clairvoyant is a schizophrenic can't turn it off. So they have like way more W's, and then they have to be medicated or physically restrained and stuff because they're a danger to themselves or others. So that was all stuff I was perceiving, all that stuff in high school, those lines of mental health, I guess is what you'd say. What's the difference between mental health? And then especially once I became a hypnotherapist and a masseuse and started doing that work, and then thinking, oh no, those people aren't crazy. They just didn't have training. They didn't have initiation. They didn't have a family cluster that protected them from the outside world. But then I realized, oh no, that it's the difference of being able to turn it off or on. And that's depending on how many W's you have in your synapses within the neural system. And so that's more of a genetic thing. So that's always, so for a while in my practice, people, especially young children that would be having nightmares and stuff, their parents would bring them to me, or a pre-adolescent or adolescent, and I would help them distinguish whether that was a mental health problem or a clairvoyance. And unfortunately, for a lot of times, it was schizophrenia, because they can't turn it off, and they're hallucinating, and they become a danger to themselves or others. And so that's just a hard, those are hard realities, or hard discussions to have, especially with parents, but with people too that have those. Because a lot of times what ends up happening is suicide. The person reaches a point where they really can't handle their life, and they realize this is it. They can take these numbing psychotropic drugs that shut them down and they feel nothing, or they can be out of control of their behavior in ways that harm other people or themselves. And that's just a harsh reality to deal with. And so it's, those are different discussions I've had, throughout my life. And then sometimes just helping people, figure for themselves. It's not something you can always do. Either you can do it or you can't. And just like if a person's a real talented musician, there's a lot of kids who just sit down and they start playing the piano, or, they're just really... And so I think clairvoyance is kind of the same thing. There's gifts. We all have gifts. And then some people don't. And so then if you don't have a real extreme talent, because I know sometimes the better musician who's more successful is the one that has to work really hard at it. And then they have the discipline, and then they become professionally successful. Whereas the natural, say, musician takes it for granted, and they don't have the drive to create an income flow from their music or their art. So it's the same with clairvoyance. It's the same thing. You just have, or... you accept what you have and do what you can.
You seem to have just a very steady practice of discerning and learning and extending grace with other people and also with yourself as you are
it's those Irish nuns.
Undertaking. I mean, my goodness. I'm going to have to ask you about the orders that taught you when you were young. We can compare notes. What have you learned to love even when it was hard to?
I think almost just the things I was talking about. It's the dichotomies, in our world. It's it's hard to accept like psychosis, like what's going on, that we have criminal psychopaths to the government, that kind of stuff. That lack of empathy or compassion that occurs in people. I think that's pretty hard to deal with. And so mostly I just get away from it, because if a person can't change or won't change, then the systems. And then what we used to call back then monkey wrenching, which is sort of a playful thing. And I see that's what's happening, like with ICE, especially in Minnesota, that they're really doing a collective societal monkey wrenching. They're staying passive, they're staying hopeful, they're going out in the cold, freezing nights and singing. And I think that's inspiring, and that's what we do. You just have to think, what am I going to do? And I think if like, again, I was raised by two parents who loved us and wanted us, and so that gives you, when you're a wanted child and a loved child and protected child, it gives you a certain amount of stamina or adaptability that sometimes other people don't have. But I've seen people who were given nothing still be really adaptable and graceful and compassionate, and that same other person is given nothing and they turn into these really criminal psychopaths and that just have no empathy. And I just think those are all the duplicities of our realities. Which one do you want to live in? And I feel like, like I've said so many times, that we're in the shift, and that really see that, especially the Gen Z. My granddaughter said Gen Z. I said, what's that? And then it's Gen Z. And then I realized that age group is like the under 30s or something, like 15 to 30. So that's my grandkids are in that. But I met this young woman recently who was raised in a very protective Catholic environment, but very educated. And I can see that generation. They're just very fluid. Like I said, they don't have homes. They don't have cars. They're just traveling. They're global citizens. They're going, oh, my job is here. Oh, my job. Oh, I'm living in Napa. And, oh, that's why I'm here. And then I'm talking about, I think I'll live in Sonoma instead of Napa. That's okay. You can live in Sonoma. Because, again, even looking at the duplicities between Napa and Sonoma, they're right neighboring communities, but they're so different. Because Sonoma is more mellower. And I think more like when people were fleeing San Francisco in the late 60s, because the temperature had changed and became sort of more of violent and aggressive, and the party was over, so a lot of people moved north. A lot of them moved to Portland, and Portland has changed because of that, because they changed the whole policy. But I know when I was choosing to live in Napa, people are like, why don't you live over here in Sonoma? I was like, well, I'm living where it's the opposite, and that negative, those crusaders, the people that profited from the mass murders in Western Europe, that old money in Napa's from the Crusades. So that's where I had intention, and I realized shortly after moving there that was where I was going to be living, where I still live.
I'm reminded that monkey wrenching, you just referred to monkey wrenching, and I'm reminded that we've had conversations in the past about how we look upon the people who are easily viewed as our opponents, and seen through the eyes of compassion, but not condoning. That has a way of monkey wrenching.
It is, yes. Kurt Vonnegut, I was trying to remember who created that term, but that was kind of the motto, I think, of the late 60s and 70s, monkey wrenching. Rather than taking the system straight on and maybe getting killed or, committing your suicide, which I was seeing a lot of young men do those things, that just to monkey wrench. And then that thing of finding legal ways to avoid the draft and all of that stuff. So I think then, that monkey wrenching, that you sort of do it right out in the open. And then people go, are you really doing that out in the open? yeah, I'm really doing it. Because that's what I've done and I'm doing still in Napa. Because it's the wealthiest people in the world live there. And I think the centuries of mass violence that have occurred, a lot of those descendants live there. And the story that I'm telling and I'm surfacing, it counters their myth of discovery,
Yeah.
And people would tell me back in the early 70s and 80s and stuff, you can't do that. They're going to kill you. And I have to say, well, they're just going to have to kill me. Because then I'll just come back. And I won't know what I look like next time. I think when you have a true belief in reincarnation and infinity of spirit, that gives you a sort of compassion and also courage to just go, well, that didn't work. Let me try this next time. If you're always, which a true intellectual is always experimenting. You think, okay, here's my hypothesis, and here's what I'm going to try, and if that doesn't work, okay, let me come up with a new hypothesis and see if this works. You know what I mean? So if you're always having that kind of attitude towards life and life's problems, it's kind of a different dynamic that keeps you from getting burnt out. Because some people say, well, how do you not get burnt out? I'm like, well, I take a lot of naps.
That's another great practice.
Yeah, or just like I took 2 days. I just the PJ, and then it was Monday. I thought Monday was still Sunday, and I was talking to my sister. I thought, know it's Monday. I got to do something. And she goes, no, it's not Monday. Sunday. It's Monday. And people don't think that I actually rest a lot. And then if people are around me, they go, gosh, you sure sleep a lot. And I'm going, well, I'm not really just sleeping. It's kind of like a reset. Or I'm dreaming. If I get to a place where I'm not sure what to do, I just go, let me just sleep for a while or dream about it, just go into a dream state and see the different alternatives. And I think when you have more of a playful attitude towards life instead of like real serious,
right?
I think most people take life too serious.
You've alluded to that, but I appreciate your saying that explicitly here.
Yeah, because it's, if you don't, like even when I started teaching meditation classes, which was back in I think 86, I got my hypnotherapy training, and it was through hypnosis that I had spontaneous recall of lots of different lifetimes and just started spontaneously threading, those dreams were actually other lifetimes and all that. And I started teaching meditation. Sometimes people would get mad at me because I would start making fun. Sometimes people would tease me and think, oh, you think this and blah, blah. And then I would start making jokes about it myself. Only I said, they said, well, now, what? You can't, you're not even taking this serious. I'm like, well, why would I take it serious? I can make funnier jokes because I understand it better than you do. So my jokes are really funnier than yours. So why would I let you make fun of me when I could make better fun of myself? And then that would just piss people off. When I was sitting on a couple of boards, like I've sat on a lot of state boards and different people would be yelling at me because I didn't, remember this one guy was the water board director of the state water board, had come to a meeting because I was asking questions nobody could answer, so they thought, okay, let's bring the big guy in, and he started yelling at me in a agendized state meeting, and he said, well, Board Member Toledo, I didn't realize you had a degree in hydrological engineering. And my brain was thinking, I knew what the word meant, but I'd never pronounced it. I thought, I wonder if I can say that. And I said, no, you're right. I don't have a degree in hydrological engineering. In fact, I'm really quite a civilian around water. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions? And he was like, no, of course not. He was crying in 10 minutes. And then the board chair decided that it would be a good time to call lunch. And he said to me, well, Board Member Toledo, what exactly are you suggesting? And I was talking about the water crisis that California's in, severe water crisis, and even though it's raining, we still have over-allocated the use of water.
Right.
Can't sustain how we use it. And I said, well, those people, are going to have to move. And he's like, you understand, you're talking about the LA basin. And I said, well, yeah. I said, all those people moved there in the last 20 years, and they're just going to have to move again. And then that's when he started just losing it. And then they called the meeting to adjourn for lunch. But then the next board meeting, 4 months later, because we met quarterly, and as board members, we could have a few minutes to introduce ourselves. We'd introduce ourselves and we could say something. So I said, well, just to address the issue, we were back in San Francisco. Everybody got a little upset about me talking about people relocating out of LA because of the mass water crises. But I have to tell you, those firestorms we were having up in Napa this past few months, people were running out of there as fast as they could possibly move. Mm-hmm. And that's all I said. But that's what we're looking at, that we're all now in this dimension on this earth we're in a time of rapid change, so we have to be prepared to adapt and adjust. make changes that we wouldn't think, And I know that all the times it flooded in Napa, because we were living in the floodplain, so we evacuated 7 times in 10 years. And then I would always say every time, well, I'd rather it be flooding than burning. And then when we were dealing with all those horrific fires like you dealt with here in Santa Rosa too, but we had dealt with it more 5 times, people do adapt and change. But it's amazing to me that a lot of those canyons, those box canyons, have had 4 or 5 firestorms. So the people are deadlocked in there and they've got to run through the fire to get out of the fire. They've rebuilt their houses. I was thinking, okay, okay, go ahead, do that. And Paradise, because I was advising them about some of their fire, and I said, well, it's ridge lines, and fires travel along ridge lines. That's not the places we're supposed to be building. And then they were rebuilding, and I was suggesting that they not, and then they burnt out again just recently. So, part of it is adapting and then having, making informed decisions.
Yeah.
About things like flooding and mass fires and earthquakes.
Deep listening seems to be really essential to all of this, to being able to confront what's hard and make peace with that and do the next right thing.
Yeah, because ultimately, and I think that's where we're all kind of in a collective denial that, you think you're going to die. There was some song like that says, oh, everybody wants to go to heaven, no one wants to go right now. That we all know that eventually we're going to die, that this is a limited term expression, this physical body, but we don't want to be today or something. And then when you realize, well, it is a kind of an end story, and when you really have experienced that, like through dreams or understanding of reincarnation, which many, many cultures in the world do, it doesn't mean that you don't fear death, but you don't just fear it as much, and you can accept it more as oh, okay, this area is wet now, we have to move. Or this area, because watching the floods, I would hike before, during, and after, and then what we developed is called the flood plan. The area that we were in, then it was a 9-year drought, so it wasn't until these last winters that we realized that plan that I came up with most of the ideas works. But then with the fires, I was watching the fires burn and realizing, oh, this is just like the flooding. The water's going where the water went. There are places where the rivers have been redirected, like in Sonoma County with Kernville and the big rivers around here, the rivers have been redirected or put through culverts, and then those have to be released and opened up, the dams, undamming. But with fires, they burn around ridge lines and box canyons, and you don't build there. Mm-hmm. But then people want to keep building there, and then they go, oh my God, it's burning again. And you're like, yeah, that. It's like, okay. Again, that hypothesis, if you did, but then you have compassion because you realize we're all in school and we all have hypotheses. And I have a friend he's actually a brilliant, world famous architect. He's one of the guys I met, his brother I was staying with in London. He's now world famous, and his idea to climate change is just to build bigger and stronger and and we'll see, because then a lot of those buildings will withstand earthquakes or fires, but not sliding mountains and stuff.
Right.
I know sometimes people think I'm cold, and I think, well, I'm not just cold, I'm just practical.
Yeah, and unafraid to speak truth to power, which is kind of the next question. Is there a moment in particular that really stands out when you've needed to speak truth to power and protect what you love?
Well, I think that's every day, really.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's, if you're speaking truth every day through your life and stuff, I think the hardest thing to deal with that is that people, will hate you. And then sometimes people that are your, quote, friends, if they're really close and watching the life choices or currents and stuff, they go, how did you do that? Mm-hmm. Or why did that happen there? And then they start to just get mad at me. And that's a hard thing to deal with. I think that's the answer to your question. I don't know. Because I'm always if you're always in truth, and you always just have to say what's real, and then people don't want you to say what's real, like the water crisis in California, and you can be at high levels of decision making, and people still want to ridicule you. And then at one point you go, okay, well, what's going to happen is going to happen, and I'm going to stop coming to these meetings because they're really boring. You just let things go, and you just realize that things are going to go the way they go. Just like if you're watching a catastrophic accident or a tree falling, you can go, oh, the tree's going to fall in the car. I remember one time they were cutting these trees, which I was always crying or sad when people were cutting trees, and it was a place we boarded our horses, and this guy was cutting the trees and being a real jerk about it, and then I had made some comment to him because our car had to stop, and then he started yelling at me, and so I just got quiet, and then we waited till the road was open and we moved. But then I was coming back to pick up my daughters from the horse riding, and the dude had left his truck, his big giant red truck, and one of the big trees they were cutting fell right on his truck. And I had made some comment about, God, you might want to move your truck. And then he didn't. He just thought I was a bitch. And so I'm back like an hour later, and his truck's all smashed. And I thought he was going to come over and like start smashing my truck with his sledgehammer or something, because he was just so pissed. But I just didn't say anything to him at that point. I was like, And then my daughter was there. She said, well, you told him. And sometimes you just don't tell them because you just think. And then people get mad at you either way, if you tell them or if you don't tell them.
Right. So. Yeah. You just have the. I so admire your curiosity, your compassion, and the courage of how both show up in all these different ways that you show up in the world.
I think getting older is hard because then you're more vulnerable. I think when you're young, you have this feeling, I can live forever, or they can just bring it on. Whereas when you're older, you realize, okay, now I really am more vulnerable. Or, people, it's interesting aging in this culture, in the Anglo culture, because there's kind of a dislike for older people. And in the Native culture, in the Hispanic culture, there's not. It's the opposite. They're very revered. And so sometimes people would say that to me, and I said, well, in my culture, I'm very revered. And if I go to Mexico, it's almost like I'm a patron saint or something. People literally just are, it's just different. So it's nice to have those. I mean, that's what gives more compassion, is you realize those are all different interpretations and don't take it personal.
What systems or narratives are you actively working to transform?
Well, I think the one that Native Americans are really focusing on, and I've been focusing on the last 20 years, is water. That water is essential to life. And that, I know it's going to get a drink because I don't want to make the bang on the table. And what I say, and I say it a lot, and sometimes I wish I could say it in a larger form, is that we're the only planet in the solar system that has water, like surface water, like this incredible rain and rivers and oceans and lakes, and they're full of fish and octopi and dolphins and whales. I mean, it's just such an amazing place, and to disregard that incredible beauty and magic is like appalling. And so what I could say that will put silence into a room of any size, that we're the only planet in the solar system to have surface water. How far do you imagine the next planet in the universe has water like this? How far is the next other planet? Just to try to help people wake up to the sacredness of water. And I think that's a thing that I focus on a lot, that story. And again, it brings us back to fluidity and change and currents and tides.
Yeah, that you use the word sacred, and I can't help coming back to that word. I mean, it's not a word that I hear in my daily life all that frequently.
Well,
we don't in this Western culture seem to have an awareness of all that's sacred.
Yeah, because sacred means special, really. Yeah. It is so special. And there isn't a thought of specialness. Just all of it, every part of it. I mean, just like the water takes the shape of the container, and then our body's 89% water. And then now they're finding, I just was reading this story today, the octopi are living in little villages, which they thought they were independent living, but they're actually under the sea living in cooperative. There's so much sentient life, and I think that's what's waking up. And that, again, that Gen Z, that younger generation, they seem to have that. Mm-hmm. That seems like I see that in my grandchildren, and even when they were young, and still now as teenagers. And this young woman I just met yesterday, I was so impressed by her. Just seeing that total sacredness of all life, and everything that they do is really conscious, and they're really like, wow, we're gonna, be take care of the sacred water. They came awoken. They didn't forget. Mm-hmm. And they haven't forgotten. And I think especially my generation, the baby boomers, anytime I'm talking to younger people, I always apologize to them on behalf of my generation. We had that sort of moment of waking up, Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead, and all those other bands and names I can't remember. It was so much fun, but then it was a closing up again. And then just this deep driven desire to accumulate material stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm always so amazed at how big the house is. Like, again, going into Lafayette, driving into the Bay Area yesterday, and seeing all those giant houses, that there's no land around them. The houses just got bigger and bigger, and then the people aren't even in there because they're so busy over there at a job that they don't like working really hard to pay for a house that they don't live in. That just seems so weird. But that's what the baby boomers did, and are still doing. Mm-hmm. They still want to go on cruises and have people waiting on them hand and foot, and I was like, wow, that just seems so odd to me. It always has seemed odd to me, my whole life. It seems odder still now. Because I thought maybe as we aged as a group that people would become more compassionate and generous, and I don't see that in my peers, which gets them to get really pissed at me again some more.
Another narrative that you're actually trying to transform.
Just and then it's interesting when you say it, because it seems like such a simple thing to say sacred, and then for you to say, I don't hear people use that word. I'm like, yeah, see, that's it. That's the flaw. That's the block, is not honoring the sacredness of every breath, of every moment is so sacred. Mm-hmm. And then just when you look at the simplicity of the water or something, it's so amazing. Then we can just drink it, and then we pee and sweat, and it rains. Just the whole thing of water is so mystical, magical. How can people aren't just... Then my kids when they were little growing up, they go, oh, it's raining. My mother's probably out there dancing naked in the rain again. Just, yeah, I'd be out there.
That's a fantastic mental picture right there. There's so much play and joy and I don't know, spirit in that, in what you've just said. Yeah. That again we don't talk about, and we don't recognize, let alone give ourselves permission to recognize that we're missing all of it.
Yeah, just to be silly about it.
Yeah.
That's what one of my elders said to me, like the first time I was going into a roundhouse, Native American roundhouse. He was sitting next to me, he goes, how is this different from how you prayed growing up? I said, well, in the Catholic Church, you had to be really quiet and just sit on these pews, and everybody was running around talking, and then they're singing and dancing and joking and laughing, and everybody's running around, and then when everybody's done, they bring all the food, and everybody eats the food, and then they dance some more, and, I was like, yeah, it's really different. And then he's like, if the people that are teaching you, or the religion, if they're not laughing, he goes, get away from them. Because that's not God. And I'm like, I can do that.
Wow. That's profound advice.
It is, yeah.
That is wild.
Yeah, it's wonderful to get it at a young age. Mm. I know I had this one elder, because I learned, because I didn't have elders. My grandmothers were dead before we were born, and my grandpas were grumpy, so we didn't really have elders a lot in our life like we do in the Native tradition. You have elders that are there and present and sit around, and you go and sit. So I would go and sit with them and then wait for them to talk. And this one friend said, he doesn't say that stuff when I'm there. I said, well, you just have to sit there. So we were at a roundhouse gathering, out on the coast, and I was just sitting with him, and nobody was talking, and then my friend was sitting there, and then he got pissed, and he walked away, and we're still just sitting there quiet watching people, and he goes, your friend, my elder's like, he's like, your friend? I'm like, yeah. He goes, I don't like him. I said, and then my response was, I didn't think so, because he wouldn't talk around him.
Mm. Wow.
And then sometimes he would come around and say stuff, because once he was making fun of me. He's like, that song you were singing, you just made it up. You can't just make up songs like that and start singing them. And then he went away, and then it was another time we were just sitting there, and he sat there and goes, and this was before the time he said, your friend there, I don't like him. He just said, where does he think the elders got the songs from? They dreamt them, they made them up, and that's why it was. But when he would say that, when people have said things like that to me, I just try to let it go. I'm just like, okay, or mostly I don't say that. And there is that, and I think that's the biggest difference. Like if you look at like California tribes compared to dominant cultures, that silence is a really intense form of communication. Mm. And one of the boards I sat on was all Native American, and we'd have outsiders come, that if that particular group, if they were silent, that meant they could agree. They didn't have questions or discussion. And so somebody was we had a lawyer or somebody advising us on something, and I could see they were getting really nervous. And I said, with this board and this group, silence means agreement. And so you can go on to the next item. And the person said, oh, thank you so much for clarifying that, because they were just getting really jittery because everybody's just staring at them. And I was like, well, silence means agreement. And they're like, oh, okay. And then in other native cultures, because they're all different, different tribe, because I think I've never traveled to India, but just what I've heard about it, the people are very vociferous and everybody's yelling. So then you would just argue about whatever. And so silence, I think, is a powerful form of communication that's also underestimated.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that. Wow. Well, I watching our time, and I want to be sure that I give you an opportunity to talk about Susquehanna Intertribal Council and the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, that's again that being in the eye of the dragon, creating something, because we had the idea or the dream, the direction, however you would talk about it, to create a land base in a hostile environment, because that was in 1992. And I had gone to the same elder that I'm referring to. He's one of the elders on the coast here, and he was one of my mentors. I had the good fortune of having some lovely mentors. So he was who I went to, because I thought, well, if I'm going to do something like that, I have to get permission from the tribes. And the tribes at that time weren't that visible or, giving permission to non-people that weren't tribal members. But I had sat with him. I'd gone, because a lot of times I'd just go to the coast and hang out with him for a couple of days. And I told him, and he said, well, who's the director? And I said, well, I think that would be me. And he said, well, who's directing you? And I said, well, I think it's God. And he goes, tell me what? He wanted me to tell him how I've got the direction. So I told that to him. And he goes, that sounds about right. And I said, well, what should I do next? And he goes, well, if you're the director and you're getting a director from God, what are you talking to me for? And that was just that thing of just listen inside of yourself to what you're being told to do. Right. But that was his permission. And then different times when I was being treated really badly in the community, I'd gone to a gathering, and he had said, his advice had been initially, don't do it. And I said, why not? Why wouldn't I do that? And he said, everybody's going to hate you. And I said, everybody who? He goes, everybody you know. The government, the state government, your friends, your family, everybody you know is going to hate you. And I'm like, okay, I think I can deal with that. But then we were starting out in there, and then we were at another gathering up someplace, and I was seeing him. I had driven by myself because nobody wanted to drive with me. And then I saw him, and he said, how's everything going? I said, well, like you said. He said, like I said what? I said, like how you said everybody's going to hate me and stuff. And he goes, who? And I said, everybody here, because we were coming to a big gathering. And he just looked around like that, and he's like, you just stay with me. I'm like, okay. He goes, bring my chair. And I would always carry his chair anyway, but I just got his chair. And then he said, open my chair. So he sat down, and we were sitting in a circle, and then he just had me sit at his feet, and he just put his arms on my shoulder. And then because he was the elder, then all of the different family members, because it was a bunch of Native people coming together, they just gather in family groups, and usually the elder would be the one sitting because they wouldn't be able to standing. And then the families would stand behind him, and so they all had to stand behind me. And that was just a whole nonverbal way of saying, I'm this.
I stand with her.
I stand behind her. You know,
Yeah.
you got a problem with her, you got a problem with me. And that was nonverbal communication and stuff. Those people didn't ever like me, but they stopped fighting against me, you know. And then those are things. So Susco was to create a land base where it was a safe place for Native people to gather in public and do ceremony and carry on our traditions, unrestricted access to land. And then we were trying initially just to get a donated land or unrestricted access to state land, like at Bothay Park or Skyline. And I won't talk about how those meetings went south pretty bad. But then the person who was the chairperson at the time, because we were forming a nonprofit, he said, you know, Charlie, these guys killed us and ran us off, and they're not going to give us anything back. If we want land, we're going to have to buy it. And I was like, oh, you know, because I was real into a non-material world. And I said, okay. So then we did start to do that. And then he left town for different reasons. But we just continued. And then we you know, we kind of bullied on land. I was watching land prices, and they were as low as I thought they were going to get. And I could tell they were going to start going up. So we were able to secure the 20 acres undeveloped land, and we got it at a really good price. And the prices, of course, doubled and tripled in the years, 1 or 2 years later. So we just kind of got in that little window, and then just again following direction to develop a Native American ceremonial place. And a lot of times we're not doing ceremonies here, but it's like with intention you create a space, and it's doing that on its own. And you know a lot of the stories of what have happened there and are happening, but again in the middle of a very hostile environment. Because Napa, you know, they're like the wine tourist, and it's not touristy marketing to say, oh, this place was fully inhabited for 10,000 years, the longest continuously inhabited place in North America. But see, those people that were living here, we killed them all. And then the survivors, we ran them off into remote, faraway places, and most of them died on the road, 101, going up into Covelos, filled with bodies of women and children that died on those bloody roads. So that was a real hostile environment. And we just, you know, you just kind of go, well, one step at a time. You just think, okay, if we're here, then what would be the next step? And then what would be the next step? And the idea was always to create a prototype that other people would replicate. So we've done that. And it's at a point now where people can go, wow, oh. And then people come out there and they go, oh my God, this is so beautiful. And we even had some Native people come because they'll be doing like tick training, traditional ecological knowledge. And they said, oh, there's this and there's that and there. And we're like, well, that's because we harvested out the invasive weeds and we let the medicinals live, and they're thriving. And so it looks like a beautiful place now, and every place on the earth is sacred. Mm-hmm. And then once you say, okay, this little table, you know, how much food could I grow here? You know, we could grow enough food for each other to eat for always, you know. And it just that if you really see that sacredness in life and say, okay, there's this little rocky abandoned parcel that is really low on the market right now that we snapped up, and then we just prayed and did ceremony and asked, what do we need to do? Where is this going to go? So everything's placed, you know, with geomancy. And you know that where we put our spiral gardens, when I was finding the center, that I found that little stone that I realized later was a meteorite. So that's, again, the cosmos talking to the earth, and the earth talking to somebody who can hear, and saying, oh, this will be the center of our spiral garden. So when that stuff is there, it's generating energy. You know, it's in prayer. It's a sacred ceremonial place. It's in ceremony continuously. And that's where now, at the point it is, where people just come. And it was never going to be open to the public. It's not open to the public because the public will just trash it. And it was more like an idea. And people were saying, oh, that's not going to happen in California. But now, 25 years later, land is being given back to the tribes. Mm-hmm. Huge parcels of land. They've undammed the rivers. And that's the work of thousands of years. The tribal people who got displaced stayed focused. And then people like myself, allies were called, you know, out-of-state assimilated Indian, would be the words the federal government used about me. But just keeping that vision and working collectively together to change the systems. But that every step was a is a victory. And then just the fact that we were able to buy land in the Napa
Right.
Valley, that sent electric current through the whole state of California. Those people, those dumb people down there, we could buy, back our traditional territory, or we could do this, and it's like, yeah, to do that. It's a opening, because then they think, well, there's this little small group of people who had no money or no nothing, and now have created something that really is a prototype. And then what we've done with cleaning up the Napa River, that consciousness put to going to meetings and process, that Napa River is the state model of how to repatriate or rematriate a watershed and heal it. It's now the cleaning model that's being used nationally. And so, those are all little steps. When you look at it collectively, you go, whoa. But that was a whole lot of people. One person making the step to be ridiculed and then saying, well, what about this? And then everybody collectively shifting the system. So that's happening. And that's what Susquehanna House is. It's kind of one of those awakening moments. But there was a lot of awakening moments around the world at the same time.
Yeah.
1992, 93. And now, again, 1986 was the end of the Piscean Age. So from 86 to 2013 was a free fall. And that's that period where those things got manifested. And now what we're seeing is it's going faster and faster because it's got the momentum, it's got the public will, and people realize their water is a sacred, life-giving force, and if we're poisoning it, and then we don't have access to it. But also seeing the beauty. I was just reading again today that the polar bears up in Alaska are fatter than they've ever been, which is bad for the seals, but good for the because before they were all skinning and starving, but now the ice is coming back. So the damage that was done during the industrial age to this earth is being repaired now, and it's no longer popular. Whatever's going on in the United States right now, I always say it's the chicken with its head cut off. It's just it's just making a bloody mess, and it doesn't know it's dead. So you just have to step back from it, not feeding into it. And I think that's what we're seeing across the country and really around the world, because now, Den Haag, there's all these countries in Western Europe and South America that are filing human rights violations against the United States of what they're doing to the immigrant population and what they're doing globally. So then those are the world courts coming in to say, oops, you've lost control of your government. We're going to take over and take these people that are in charge and put them in prison if you can't do it yourselves. Yeah. And that's the movement right now, and that's where things will be, that things will be changing faster and faster towards balance and really honoring and seeing the sacredness of every day and the beauty that surrounds us, because then you don't have the feeling to consume.
Right.
You don't have to get drunk.
Right. Yeah.
Or unless you want to.
Yeah. Charlie, our last question. This has been absolutely fascinating and a joy to be in this conversation with you. My head is like full of all kinds of ideas and reflections, and I could go on and on, but this conversation is about you, not about me. So,
no, it's great. No, I'd love to hear about you.
As a closing reflection, though, I want to ask you, what's one small thing that you do or witness that reminds you that we were made for these times?
I think just looking at the young generations, how that's that next cycle coming in, and they're so full of joy and innocence, They really are not wanting to consume stuff, and they're wanting to deconstruct what was happening, but in a gentle and loving way, and really in a global way. I think that's just seeing that open-hearted generations of people that are here now, and they're not going to replicate what they're seeing.
There's a researcher that I heard about in a podcast a year or so ago who had done a lot of research on hope. And hope has elements to it. The elements of hope are having a plan and having agency. It's really simple. And what you've just described about this generation, they have a plan and they have agency. And it's a beautiful thing to reflect on as we think about the rupture and the chaos that we're experiencing.
And then if you think of it as a dispelling of what is, that those illusions are just cracking wide open. The chaos has purpose, just like a woman in labor. I always describe, I delivered a bunch of babies at home. But that can look very chaotic, and the woman can feel like she's dying, and the baby feels like their world's crashing in. But really, it's that birth, it's that expression of the next phase. So what's happening is the dissembling of all of I think it's really anger that's being dissembled. There's people that's raging against how they were treated as babies. Mm-hmm. And that's where that sacredness comes again. If just every baby is a wanted baby, whether it's an octopi or a dolphin or a whale or an ant.
Right.
Person, ant villages. We change the way we talk about our sentient life forms. And when I say ant villages, that always changes. Little kids, because I talk to a lot of little kids, and I'll say, well, the ant villages. I'm going to tell stories about the ant villages. And they go, the villages? And it changes your perception just there, right there, immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Well, we're going to close on the ant villages.
Let's do that. I love
That's
it. Thank
beautiful.
you so much. I know.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. So, folks, thanks for listening. We're grateful that you've joined us in community today and that you believe, just like we do, in the importance of building belonging, resilience, and justice in this region. We know it will have ripple effects across the state and across the country and around the world. So your presence is really meaningful, and we're very grateful for it. If you'd like to get even more involved with the work that United Way of the Wine Country is doing, please join us. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and follow us in social media. You'll find us in Facebook, and you'll find us in LinkedIn, and you'll find us in Nextdoor. We're banned from Instagram. I'll leave that to you to figure out why that might have happened. Sign up for our newsletter at our website, www.unitedwaywinecountry.org, and share our conversations with a friend. Feel free to have the same conversations that we're having here with your friends. The more of us having conversations like this, the more we'll all appreciate that we are the leaders that we're looking for. And we're just looking for a place to get started. Thanks for starting here. Before we close, I want to invite you to learn more about and support the incredible work of the Susquehanna Intertribal Council led by Charlie Toledo. By showing up for Susquehanna, we can help make Native lives, culture, and truth more visible, known, and understood. This work matters, not just for Indigenous communities, but for all of us who are committed to social, racial, gender, economic, and environmental justice. Supporting Susquehanna is one of the ways that we can practice responsibility and reciprocity, honoring the land we live on and who provides for us, the histories we inherit, and the future we are shaping together. I encourage you to visit their website, follow their work, share it with others, and give if you're able. When we show up in these ways, we help create a more truthful, connected, and beloved community, one rooted in respect, care, and relationship.